Hi, everybody. Brad Truax here again from Eastman Woodlands and Wildlife Committee. Today, we're going to do an update on our presentation about beavers that we first did in 2020. The beaver, its Latin name is Castor canadensis. Obviously, canadensis has something to do with Canada. And if you recall, the beaver is, in fact, the symbol of Canada. The beaver is the largest rodent in North America. It may weigh anywhere between 30 and 100 pounds, although most of them are a bit less than 50 pounds. And they're highly territorial. They're also crepuscular, which means they're most active at dusk and dawn. The beaver can swim at 5 miles an hour. It has webbed hind feet that are used for swimming, and they use their tail as a rudder. They can hold their breath for about 15 minutes, but they usually only stay underwater for 5 or 6 minutes at a time. And their nostrils and ears have valves that close when they're underwater and nictitating membranes that cover their eyes when they're underwater. And their heart rate decreases about 50% when they're diving. The beavers are monogamous, which means they pair for life, and they breed in winter. Their kits are born in May or June, usually 3 to 5 kits per year. And the young will stay with the family for roughly 1 to 2 years. Young beavers usually are sent off on their own at about 2 years. Beavers in the wild can live up to about 10 years old. Beavers have three most salient characteristics are their fur, their tail, and their teeth. The beaver's coat has almost, actually over 100,000 hairs per square inch. And these hairs function to keep the beaver warm. They help it float when in water, and they help protect it against predators. Some of the hairs are called guard hairs. Those are 2 to 2.5 inches long, and they protect the rest of the fur of the beaver. And the beavers also produce an oily substance from their anal glands, and this helps them waterproof their coat. And the beavers molt every summer, which means they shed their coat and grow a new coat. And you have to remember the beavers once very widely trapped because of their pelts, the value of their pelts. The second salient characteristic is the tail. And the beaver's tail, the proximal part of the tail is conical, hairy, and very muscular. The rest of the tail is flat. That's the one that you are used to seeing in the water. The beaver's tail helps it stay upright if it's chewing on a tree and kind of standing up. It acts as a rudder while they're swimming, and it stores fat for the winter. Very interesting. And also, there's something unique about the vascular supply of the tail that helps regulate their body heat, whether they're in hot or cold temperatures. But the beaver's tail also has yet another function. It makes a loud slap on the water, and that slap may be a warning or simply a means of communication. There you hear a famous slap of the beaver. The third salient feature of the beaver is the beaver's teeth. They're famous for their iconic buck teeth. They have four incisors that are long and separated from other parts of their dental arch. And interestingly, these incisors are actually hardened with iron, which sometimes causes a somewhat orange discoloration. It's also interesting, they're not the only animal that has iron enforced teeth. The Komodo dragon is at least one other animal that has iron in their teeth. The beavers also have a second layer of lips behind the incisors, and these protect the beaver from swallowing excessive amounts of water when it's chewing on or gnawing on wood underwater. And they also have molars that they use for grinding. The beavers also have two pairs of special glands. One is the castor sac, and these are part of the urethra, and they also have the anal glands, which I previously mentioned. The castor sacs secrete castoreum, which is a liquid substance that's used mainly for marking their territory. The anal glands produce that oily substance that the beaver uses as a waterproof ointment for its coat. And that substance also probably plays a role in individual and family recognition. So are you confused? Was what you saw in the water a beaver? Or was it an otter? Or was it a muskrat? Or was it a mink? All four of these aquatic animals may superficially resemble each other, particularly when you only see their head in the water. So again, here's a river otter, here's a muskrat, here's a mink, and here's the beaver. So how do we differentiate them? Well, the basic ways we differentiate them are from their size and their tail. If we see the tail, the beaver again is the biggest at about 50 pounds, and it has very few chin whiskers. It's got a large paddle-like tail, and when it's swimming in the water, there's kind of a pulsing tail motion. And you may again hear the slap that we previously heard. When they swim, usually their head is only above the water, and they tend to swim in a straight line. So you'll see a trailing V in the water behind them. And the beavers eat woody plants, twigs, and trees. So sometimes you'll see them swimming with a stick or some sort of wood in their mouth. On the other hand, the river otter is a bit smaller, somewhere between 10 and 30 pounds, and has very prominent chin whiskers. You might even see it with a fish in its mouth because, again, the river otters basically eat seafood and things that you find in the water. Its tail is much narrower and it's tapered. And when they're swimming, they twist and turn quite a bit. Sometimes they'll make dolphin-like moves, and they're very playful when they're in the water. A muskrat is very small compared to either the beaver or the otter. It only weighs between 1 and 4 pounds and tends to have a chubby appearance, but it's got a long, skinny rat-like tail. And when it swims, that back tail flickers and helps propel them. We'll show you a video of that in a minute. And they eat mostly grasses, so you might see them swimming with grass in. And lastly, the mink is much smaller, usually about 3 pounds. And the mink, being part of a member of the weasel family, has a long, streamlined body with a much smaller head than the muskrat has. And it has darker fur and a long, furry tail. So again, beavers tend to swim straight, often a V in the water trailing them. Again, here we have one swimming. So he's swimming in a straight line. There goes the tail. Once again, the straight line, but here comes the tail. And once again, pretty straight line. You can barely make out the V shape in the water behind them. Their tail tends to produce a pulsing motion when they're in the water. The river otters, on the other hand, are much more likely to turn, and their swim is more playful. So again, here's the river otter swimming. A lot of twisting and turning and playfulness. There he goes. They tend to go underwater. They'll disappear for a while, pop up in another area. And once again, here he's going to pop out of the water, swimming around, not in a straight line. He moves all over, twists and turns. And there, when he popped out, you actually saw a fish in his mouth. Now, a muskrat, when the muskrat swims, their tail moves side to side when they're swimming. It produces kind of a flickering motion in the water. So here you're going to see a swimming muskrat. Here he comes. Well, watch that tail. So again, it's a skinny rat-like tail, and it's moving side to side in a very flickering sort of manner. Much different than what we see with the beaver. So those are some of the ways we differentiate those four mammals from each other when we see them swimming in the water. Well, signs of beaver activity are very common. The beavers here were active in collecting some wood at the edge of our wetland. This was just off the Yellow Trail in Heath Forest here at Eastman. And you can see some lots of wood chips on the ground. They also left quite a sculpture here. I note the larger tree stump here in the middle. That was left by the beaver. But also note these small spikes. They left numerous of these small spikes. Beavers are particularly fond of stems that are 3 inches or less in diameter. And that's because they often use those in constructing their dams, and also they bring them into a cache underneath their lodge, and they actually eat these through the winter months. In fact, some of these spikes were so sharp and were adjacent to one of our trails that they actually imposed a danger. Somebody could have tripped and fallen on one of these and actually impaled themselves on this. So we actually had to go out and cut these down and flatten them out so nobody would injure themselves. Okay, beaver tracks. The beaver, again, the front paws almost resemble human hands. They're basically 5 fingers, sometimes only 4 show, but usually you do see claws. The hind tracks typically have 5 toes, but there's evidence of webbing. So if you look here, these are the front tracks up here. The hind tracks are much bigger, and you can see and imagine the webbing that's between the toes there. Again, claw marks are usually present on both the front and the hind paws, and the tracks are sometimes obscured by marks left by their dragging tail. This is showing beaver trail in the snow, much of which is covered by this their tail leaving a mark in the snow. Beaver scat, you're not going to see it. Basically, that's because the beavers tend to defecate underwater. And their scat usually consists of balls of sawdust. Not surprising, since all they eat is basically woody products. So what do beavers eat? Again, they're true vegetarians. They eat leaves, bark, twigs, sprouts, fruits and buds or shrubs and trees, and some of the aquatic plants, such as sedges and rushes that are in the wetland or adjacent to it. In the summer, they may be eating grasses and leaves and some of the roots of those aquatic plants, and they may eat some of the bark that they've stripped away from trees. And sometimes they'll eat berries. But in the winter, they cache leaves and especially bark of saplings, and they'll cache branches to eat in the wintertime. Their preferred woody plants are alder, aspen, birch, maple, and willow. They tend to avoid eating evergreens, but they will use evergreens occasionally for building. And I mentioned before that small diameter stems, those that are 3 inches or less, are most heavily sought by the beavers. And the beavers have bacteria in their intestines that help them digest the cellulose that's in these woody products. And beavers typically feed within 100 yards of the edge of the pond. And one beaver may eat up to 200 aspens per year. So again, they really consume a lot of woody products. The beavers do have some predators, wolves, coyotes, bears, lynx, and of course humans. And again, hunting and deforestation led to disappearance of the beavers here in New Hampshire in the 19th century and elsewhere. The beavers are very easily caught when they're on land. River otters will occasionally break into their den and kill some of the kits. Mink may also attack the young beavers. And in winter, when the water is frozen, predators might walk right up to the lodge. This is showing the beaver lodge. And the beaver lodge is built either against the bank of a stream or in open water. And the dome-shaped structure is built with mud and sticks. And there are entrances underwater. I'll show you those in a minute. And their living quarters are above the water level. So again, here's a classic illustration of the beaver lodge. So once again, you see at least 3 layers. One underwater, and this has 2 entrances. And you see this cache of sticks and small pieces of lumber that they're going to use for eating all winter long. Here's a beaver bringing some branches and leaves over here to leave in this cache. Then on this second level is a place where they'll tend to dry off. That's when they first come out of the water. And then the main area of the lodge is above the water level. That's what they use for sleeping and breeding. So again, there's at least two entrances below the water surface. And the chamber above has two levels, the lower tier for feeding and drip drying fur, and the upper level is the sleeping chamber, also used for mating. And the cache of sticks is kept below the water line. They use that as a food source in the winter. The beaver lodge, again, the temperature is maintained at 32 degrees. It's well insulated with mud and snow, and the beavers' bodies do radiate heat, so sometimes they'll huddle up together to keep each other warm. It's interesting that dens that are against the banks of rivers or lakes tend to be cooler than those that are out in the open water. And again, in this picture, you can see the breath of the beaver rising above the top of the lodge through a vent. So how do beavers survive the winter? Well, again, the lodge temperature is maintained at about 32 degrees. And once again, that's because it's insulated very well with mud and snow. And it's warmed by the beavers huddling together and radiating their body heat. The beavers also store fat in their tail, and they utilize this fat over the winter. Adult beavers are able to reduce their metabolic rate. The younger beavers tend not to. And the pile of sticks underwater at the base of the lodge is basically their food source that they'll use all winter long. And the adults will retrieve these sticks, bring them up for their young to feed on. And the beavers do sleep together in that upper lodge for warmth. And sometimes they'll even, interestingly, allow a muskrat to come in. Single beavers tend to fare less well than those that are living in families. The beaver fur is thick in winter, and once again, they spread oil from their anal glands that tends to make their fur waterproof. And if there's some open water, they may venture out in the wintertime to eat trees. Here's a beaver lodge in Johns Glen. This basically popped up in the winter of 2023 to 24. Ordinarily, beaver dams are built in running water, but the lodge can be built in any place where there's water deep enough to conceal the entrances. This lodge in Johns Glen was a bit unusual in that it's on an island in the middle of one of the polishing ponds. Beavers also are very adept at digging canals through the wetlands. So they can swim right up to the forest, cut down a tree, and drag it back out to the dam or the lodge without being eaten by a predator. The other interesting thing we found in Johns Glen, in the polishing pond that's adjacent to the one where the lodge was, we saw this long line underneath the ice. And if you look where this goes, it goes to a wooded area over here. And in all likelihood, what happened was that the beavers who live in the lodge on the adjacent polishing pond would go over to this wooded area, cache some sticks, swim underwater with those sticks, and then use them either for constructing the new lodge or for serving as their cache of food for the winter. Very interesting. Here's a beaver dam. Why do beavers build dams? Well, they do it for a variety of reasons. It provides food, shelter, warmth, helps reproduction, and protects them from predators. There's a greater water surface and depth that makes it easier for them to drag food and branches and other materials they're using for construction. And it prevents the underwater entrance to the den or the lodge from freezing over. It provides more vegetation to serve as sources for food. And they tend to store and cache their food in underwater near the entrance to the lodge. And once again, there are a few predators that can enter the lodge once the water is deep enough. So the beaver dams, again, are constructed of branches, rocks, leaves, and other debris, and they pack it with mud from the stream bottom. It's amazingly leak-proof, and the beavers are very quick to repair any leaks. If they hear water running through the dam, they look for a leak and they plug it almost immediately. A beaver dam is typically about 4 to 7 feet across, but it can be much larger. There's one near a cabin we have in northern Ontario that's almost 100 feet across. And they often add to the dam as the water level rises. And sometimes they'll build smaller dams to relieve some pressure on the main dam. It's interesting. Just today, we were out in Heath Forest, and it looks like they're building a smaller dam near the main dam that we find along the Yellow Trail in Heath Forest. So again, here's what a beaver dam looks like close up. Once again, constructed with branches, rocks, leaves, and lots of other debris, and then packed with mud from the stream below. And again, amazingly leak-proof and amazingly strong. In fact, so strong that animals can walk right across it. Here's a video of deer taken on a game cam near the main beaver dam off the Yellow Trail in Heath Forest. We have at least 3 beaver dams in Eastman's wetlands. There's one, the main one is this one right here. This is off the Yellow Trail in Heath Forest. And you can see a second dam upstream when you're sitting on the bench further down on the Yellow Trail. I'll show you a picture of that in a minute. And there's a third one upstream in Bog Brook. And as I mentioned before, interestingly, it looks like there's a fourth one being constructed upstream from this main dam in Heath Forest, so someplace up in here. This is the second beaver dam you can see in the distance if you're sitting on the bench that's about halfway out on the Yellow Trail in Heath Forest. So beavers in the wetlands. Beavers are the architects of the wetlands and ultimately much of the landscape here in North America. They're incredible engineers and construction crews for building wetlands, and they're really the keepers of the wetland ecology. And historically, they weren't appreciated until they were gone. It kind of reminds us of us boomers of the old Joni Mitchell song. Don't it always seem to know that you don't know what till you got till it's gone. So beavers are a keystone species. They're 2 interrelated concepts, keystones and trophic cascades. And they both illustrate what happens when you remove one element can disrupt an entire ecology. So a keystone basically is a wedge-shaped rock that holds up an arch. And if you remove that keystone, the entire structure crumbles. So again, beavers are the keystone to the wetland ecology. And if you remove them, the wetland ecology would crumble and the broader ecology would suffer as well. So there are other biological keystones, the salmon in Alaska, elephants in the savanna, and wolves in Yellowstone are all keystone species. The trophic cascade is related. Aldo Leopold, who's a famous naturalist, ecologist, and conservationist, first recognized in the early 20th century that removal of alpha predators led to deleterious effects on the ecology. If you haven't gone there yet, we strongly advise that you go to this URL, which will be in the PowerPoint that we will put on the Eastman website. But again, it's How Wolves Changed Rivers. And there's a story about Yellowstone Park. When the alpha predators, the wolves, were removed from Yellowstone many, many years ago, there were widespread long-term implications. And in 1995, wolves were reintroduced to Yellowstone. So the wolves began to cull out the deer and elk populations, which had been eating the foliage. And the foliage they were eating was especially young willow, aspen, and cottonwood plants that the beavers need. So once the wolves were there, the deer and the elk also began to avoid the valleys. And as a result, the foliage began to regenerate, forests reappeared, and willows reappeared. Well, once that happened, songbirds and beavers began to reappear. And the beavers built dams, they created ponds that had benefits to many species. And the wolves also killed some coyotes that had been eating small mammals. So again, those other animals that feed on small mammals were able to return to the area. And bears and eagles would sometimes feed on the carrion that was left behind by the wolves. And the river changed. There was actually less erosion and the banks became more stable. So again, this is a trophic cascade. It tells you what happens when one species was removed or reintroduced, had these widespread changes that occurred. Fur trappers in the 19th century largely wiped out the beaver population, particularly in the Northwest, but also here in New Hampshire. And Ben Goldfarb, who wrote the most important book on beavers, which we'll talk about later on, had this quote: "The disappearance of beavers dried up the wetlands and meadows. It hastened erosion. It altered the course of numerous streams and imperiled water-loving fish, fowl, and amphibians, basically creating an aquatic dust bowl." Logging also reduced beaver food sources, and beautiful and ecologically wonderful wetlands got replaced by arroyos and wadis. These are basically dry stream beds. And trapping and deforestation nearly eliminated the beaver from New Hampshire in the late 1800s. And between 1926 and 1930, 6 beavers were released in New Hampshire as part of a restocking program. 48 more were released in 1940. And by 1955, the entire state of New Hampshire was repopulated with beavers. This is showing what beaver trapping did. It turned this beautiful area into this. So again, striking. There are a number of tributes to the beaver. Again, Ben Goldfarb in his book, Eager. Beavers, the animal that doubles as an ecosystem, are the ecological and hydrological Swiss Army knives, capable in the right circumstances of tackling just about any landscape scale problem that you can confront. And another famous quote was, "Beaver Pond is more than a body of water supporting the needs of beavers, but it's the epicenter of the whole dynamic ecosystem." So the wetland at Eastman really is a jewel of biodiversity. It sits between Johns Glen and Heath Forest. It's best viewed from the Yellow Trail in Heath Forest, and it's formed near the confluence of Bog Brook and Eastman Brook. It's part of the McDaniels Marsh watershed, and under that watershed sits an aquifer that's the main water source for the town of Grantham. Several prior consultants we had here at Eastman raved about the value of our wetlands, and the beaver is the keystone to that wetland. The entire wetland ecology is really dependent upon the beaver dams. So beavers, again, are the keystone to that wetland. They play a vital role in maintaining and diversifying both the stream and the riparian habitat. And by constructing dams that impound the water and retain sediment, they substantially alter the physical, chemical, and biological characteristics of the entire ecosystem surrounding the river and streams. They produce benefits to plants, fish, and wildlife. And the beaver dam wetlands provide a habitat for vegetation, for aquatic invertebrates, for fish, amphibians, reptiles, birds, and mammals. So there are numerous benefits to the beaver pond. Again, it provides a habitat for a variety of wildlife species. Minks, muskrat, bats all tend to forage in and around the beaver ponds. Moose may eat wetland plants at the edges of the beaver pond. And a whole host of other wildlife really rely heavily on these beaver-created habitats. They can also provide great habitat for birds like great blue herons and ospreys and kingfishers. And historically, the beaver marshes were critically important breeding areas for a number of marsh birds. When beaver ponds are flooded, some of the trees die and turn into snags. And snags basically are dead standing trees And these in turn are used as habitat for many insects, birds, and mammalian species. So again, it's not just fishermen and wildlife who benefit from the beaver. The weight of the water in the beaver pond actually presses the water deeper into the ground, and that helps recharge our aquifers for use downstream by farms and other properties. And the sediments and pollutants are filtered out into the slack waters, so it actually cleanses the flow. Floods will dissipate in the ponds, and wildfires will hiss out in some of these wet beaver meadows. And the wetlands capture and store spring rain and snowmelt and release the water later in delayed pulses that help sustain crops through dry spells during the summer. These are all mentioned by Ben Goldfarb again in his book Eager. So again, there's some direct benefits to humans of the beaver pond, reducing flood damage, recharging the water aquifers, removing many of the pollutants, protecting against drought, and decreasing erosion. And there are a whole host of other benefits that occur to the animals and other areas. This is showing out west after a wildfire destroyed thousands of acres of trees. What was left was related to the beaver pond. And in Maggie Creek in Nevada, the beavers turned this into this much lusher area. They had a project out there. The cattle had grazed away most of the vegetation, and the project involved some fencing and planting. But then the beavers took over. The beavers built a dam. It produced 20 more acres of open water and 3 miles of wetland stream length. And it converted basically a seasonal stream into a perennial stream. And there was a 2-foot increase in the water table underneath the area. This produced 100 more acres of riparian vegetation, and it resulted in production of 1,000 pounds of grass per acre. Really striking. And from a rancher's perspective, the beavers increased production tenfold. So again, really striking positive response to the beaver dam and construction of the beaver pond. Well, beaver ponds also have a succession. Just like our forests have a succession, the beaver ponds also have a succession. So they're dynamic areas. There's a series of habitat types that happens as the beaver pond changes. Once the beaver pond is abandoned, such as if there's damage to the dam, or the beavers have eaten too much of the woodlands around the beaver pond, they turn into beaver meadows. And you can see a beaver meadow here at Eastman. If you go out the Butternut Trail to Spring Brook Trail, there is something we call the wetland spur. And if you take the wetland spur, you see a vast area that is really a beaver meadow. And beaver meadows are ideal area for grouse and other birds to rear their broods. Deer and many other animals will use these areas in summer because the edge is created between the woods and the meadow. And this is showing a beaver meadow. And this again is out off the wetland spur. Look at all the wildflowers that are out there. You can see after the water is drained, there's a lot of sediment that's left, so sedge and grass-covered field occur, and that's called a beaver meadow. Lots of flowers and wild diverse plants pop up. And again, there are many snags out there, basically dead standing trees that again can be great habitat for a variety of birds or cavity living mammals. And all this leads to a habitat that's very desirable for a number of wildlife species. But beavers can also be nuisances. They can fell valuable trees. They can eat ornamental shrubbery that's planted near their ponds. Their dams can produce unwanted flooding. And dams near culverts often lead to flooding of the roadways. And rarely they can carry diseases, rabies, giardiasis, tularemia. And very rarely they might attack humans or pets. Again, I want to stress that's very rare for that to happen. Here's an example of flooding This is in Andes Alley. Andes Alley is an area that connects the so-called bridge to nowhere to Johns Glen. We used to use this for walking and skiing between uh, Heath Forest and Johns Glen, or I'm sorry, between the Brookside Pond, Brook Pond to Johns Glen. It would avoid us going on the road. And at one time, you could actually ski and hike there. But now, after the Beavers built their dam, it caused flooding in Andes Alley back in 2020. So it made it impassable. Culverts are also the Achilles heel of American infrastructure. They become areas of flooding, and that can collapse the overlying roads. And Ben Goldfarb wrote in his book a story, a very typical story. A young beaver ages out. Remember, we said that at about 2 years, the young beaver gets kicked out of the family. So he's pushed out to look for his own territory. And he spots a roadway that's near a culvert. And he says, gee, that looks like just like a dam that needs to be repaired. So he goes about building his own dam there, creates his own beaver pond, and that causes flooding of the overlying road. So beavers can be nuisances. So how do we deal with nuisance beavers? Should we kill them? Should we trap them and relocate them? Neither of those strategies makes a whole lot of sense. And that's because other beavers are either the original beavers or other beavers are very likely to return to the wetland from which they were removed. And quite frankly, they will return. So there are much more humane ways to deal with the problem. First of all, you need to think about prevention, and then you need to think about slow devices, things we call beaver deceivers, which I'll show you in a minute. So trapping and relocating is not usually very successful. First of all, you couldn't just trap and relocate one beaver. You actually would have to trap and relocate the entire family. But the bottom line is that may not be legal in your state, and it's just going to create the same problem in the area where you relocate them. But the biggest reason is that they're going to come back. So there's very little reason to trap and relocate them. That solution would be a very temporary one, not a permanent one. But if you think about prevention, there are a number of things you could do if you're planning on building near a stream. You can protect some of the trees by wrapping them with a hardware cloth. If you have ornamental plants or culverts or small ponds, you could produce some fencing with mesh woven into the wire fences. You might clear the trees and shrubs that are near the ponds, and don't plant any crops or potential food sources within 100 yards of any streams or ponds. And again, this is just showing a woven wire fence that could be put around a tree or ornamental plant to keep the beavers out. The beaver management in New Hampshire, there are methods that Fish and Game uses to try to control the beaver populations. There is an annual open trapping season, which is geared to harvest any surplus beavers. And the beavers are also taken out of season by a licensed trouble trapper. And in the past, officers of the conservation officers used to trap and move nuisance beavers, but they've largely stopped that because it was labor intensive, very costly, required permits and damage liability, and it required having sites you could relocate them to, but mostly because it was unsound biological management. As we said before, beavers are either the original beavers or new beavers are going to return to those areas. So again, beavers are protected in New Hampshire by statute. One of the solutions are beaver deceivers. These are humane ways of dealing with potential flooding that's caused by beaver dams. Actually, the term is applied to a whole group of hardware devices that are capable of diverting the water flow and reducing the flooding risk. It can be very cost effective compared to the costs that would require repeated beaver trapping and removal or repair of road damage that occurs. So why are they called beaver deceivers? Well, ordinarily the beavers rapidly plug up any leaks in their dams. They don't realize that water is running through a pipe, so they're deceived. And you can lower the water level of the pond by about a foot before they'll tend to build another dam. So this is showing a flow device at a culvert. Here's the culvert going under a roadway. And again, this is an example of a beaver deceiver. Here's another illustration showing what happens. There's a long pipe that actually goes through the dam and then down below. And then there's a second kind of a filtering area out here. This is again showing a beaver deceiver that's in use. And again, this is another one. This is in Londonderry. This was done by the Department of Transportation. It shows the mesh over the culvert at the right. There's a submerged pipe that you can't see. It goes under here through the beaver dam. And there's a filter out here at the left. And this is showing Skip Lyle, who's the New Hampshire expert on beaver deceivers. And here he's installing a beaver deceiver at Elbow Pond. Once again, a beaver deceiver. So what are the benefits of the beaver deceivers? Water flow is restored, flooding is prevented, costly unclogging of culverts is avoided, costly repairs to the overlying roadways are avoided, and the beaver gets to stay. So there are a whole host of benefits. So you do lose some benefits of the beaver pond, but many of the benefits are preserved. So again, the wetlands in Eastman are ecological wonders, and they're amazing wildlife habitats. I call them our underutilized jewels. Again, our best known wetland lies between Johns Glen and Heath Forest, and it's fed by Bog Brook and Eastman Brook, and it's molded by the beaver dams that are located in those areas. And the less well-known wetland really is a beaver meadow, and that's the one that I mentioned that's off the wetland spur. And both these areas are vastly underutilized. Each could have an elevated platform or walkway for viewing the birds and the wildlife. And the southern wetland could also benefit from having kayak access. So why aren't we using them? I would love to see something like this. This is an example of a wetland viewing platform. And wouldn't it be nice if we could build something like that in our wetland so people could actually visualize many of the wildlife species that are out in the wetland? So where do we go now? How do we balance our dedication to wildlife and the ecology with our commitment to provide recreational activities and protect property? Well, could we relocate the ski trail? Well, we've been talking about that for years. It'd actually be fairly expensive to relocate it. But we have to ask the question, is there a threat to property or roadways? And if so, how do we mitigate these detrimental aspects without removing the beavers? And one of those ways might be with use of something like the beaver deceiver. So are there potential solutions that don't involve killing the beavers or relocating them? And could we better utilize the water from the expanding beaver pond? Could we take better advantage of our wetland jewels? So again, how can we monitor the wildlife and beaver behavior that's out there? Can we use drones, game cams, something called the Motus Tower? And where will the next beaver dam appear? Can we predict where it's going to occur and what are its implications? And interestingly, I've only asked this question, why aren't we using this water anyway? In 2020, we had the worst drought that we've seen in years. And the surface water levels were low, water tables were low, and Eastman was on water use restrictions. Experts actually our experts on climate change predict that we're going to have extended summer droughts for many years to come, punctuated by periods of heavy precipitation. We've been very fortunate in the last 3 years that we haven't had significant drought. And the beavers have created a potential source for water in Eastman. So why aren't we using it? The polishing ponds basically contain reclaimed water that Eastman uses to irrigate the golf course. So again, there's a pumping station at the polishing ponds. It sits 50 to 100 yards away from most of the beaver pond. And couldn't we use that pumping facility to pump water up from the beaver pond and use it during periods of drought to help irrigate the water, the golf course? Interesting concept. That would be a win-win-win for Eastman, the ecology, and the beaver. Interesting. We may have to consider that in future years. When you lose beavers, something very interesting happened just this year. In June of 2024, there was a cascade of events that had both good and bad outcomes. Heavy rains created a new channel in the beaver dam on Grass Pond. That was a big beaver pond that sits just off exit 14 and US Highway 89. You would see that as you're coming southbound and look off to your right, you would see a beaver pond. That was called Grass Pond. And this new channel basically led to almost complete drainage of Grass Pond. If you drive by there today, you'll basically see there's no water at all in it, or very little. And interestingly, there weren't any beavers left there to repair that damage. At the same time, in June, a non-Eastman landowner removed the beavers and 2 beaver dams that were sitting just north of Mill Pond. The bad result of these 2 things was that sediment and phosphates poured into Mill Pond and over the dam on Mill Creek into Eastman Lake. 2 of the biggest threats to Eastman Lake and our watershed are sediment and phosphates. But much of the phosphates were apparently absorbed by Mill Pond, but much of the sediment continued to pass right through. The good thing was that there had been a couple Eastman properties that were near Mill Pond that had been flooded as a result of these beaver dams. And as a result of that, the flooding is at least temporarily disappeared. Another good thing was the Department of Transportation had planned to put a beaver deceiver in at the beaver dam at Grass Pond, and they were waiting for the water level to drop lower so they could put that beaver deceiver in. So now, since there's no water there, they might be a good time to put in that beaver deceiver. However, we don't know if the water is ever going to return to Grass Pond. So again, the heavy rain caused these channels up here at Grass Pond to open wide. There were no beavers to repair it. The landowner right in this area had 2 beaver dams, and he removed the beavers and those dams. So again, water rushed into Mill Pond, which sits here, and then Mill Creek, and sediment went all the way into Eastman Lake. So again, this cascade basically brought sediment and phosphates into the lake. So the issues that come up here, again, the beavers may have abandoned Grass Pond prior to the recent events, so we can't rely on them to close that recently opened channels. But beavers, old ones or new ones, are very likely to rebuild one or more of the dams on the creek just north of Mill Pond. So if they do, we need to consider implementing a beaver deceiver there. And again, it's kind of complicated because those dams were on property that was not Eastman property. It would require working collaboratively with the owner of that property. Okay, that's a bit about beavers. If you want to learn more about beavers, the classic book on beavers is called Eager, and it's written by Ben Goldfarb. It was back in 2018. It's a great book. I'd highly recommend that you do it. Ben Goldfarb has also done numerous YouTube videos on beavers. You can also go to the new UNH Cooperative Extension and learn a lot about beavers and how they are controlled here in New Hampshire. And another good website located here. And again, these URLs will be available on the PowerPoint that will accompany this video on the Eastman web page. So here are some great studies that you can go to. And that's all about beavers. It's the update that we've done. We hope that you've gained something from these, and hopefully we'll come back at some time.